Hi, everyone. Just wanted to let you know we'll get started in the next few minutes. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, this is Phil Verghese. We will start in just a moment.
Hello, all. Just waiting for a few more persons to join. We have a fairly long list of folks that had registered, so we'll give it about another minute, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I just want to welcome you all to this month's episode of Talking Tuesday. My name is Fanula Darwin, and I work with all of our customers and partners here at Clever. And today I get the pleasure of kicking off today's session. We use these Talking Tuesday sessions to bring people together who are interested really in the benefits of knowledge sharing by providing this real-time platform to exchange ideas not only with our experts, but with also others in the trenches that are going through some of the same challenges as you are. Although we are starting everyone today on mute, we do want this to be a very interactive session. So please feel free to jump in with your questions or type them into the chat window that I'll be monitoring. We'll also be recording today's session, and we'll post it to our community with highlights for those who were unable to attend the live session. So with logistics out of the way, I would like to introduce you all to Phil Verghese, our CEO and co-founder here at Clever. He leads us off today with some provocative excerpts from his recent keynote address on disruptive technology that he gave at the Joint Service Symposium in Chicago last month. After that, we plan to open it up for some Q&A on the topics he discussed there. We also received some great questions from folks with your registration forms, so we'll get to as many of those as we can as well. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to you. Phil?
Thanks so much, Fanula. Greetings, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yep.
So I plan to spend a couple of minutes going over what I had talked about in Chicago, and then I think I'll move to something which would be quite relevant for us in the knowledge world, and that's the difference between simple, complicated, and complex problems. And then we will get right into the meat of things. So the theme of the conference last month was, in the context of services, is technology alone going to lead the future, and people become secondary to the technology? Can we get automated out of existence effectively? Or is it people enabled by technology that makes a difference? So what I started talking about is what exactly is a disruptive technology. And Clay Christensen talks about a disruptive technology as one that really forces companies to radically rethink everything about themselves, why they exist, should they exist, and how they should exist. And the interesting thing about most disruptive technologies is at first they seem to be quite primitive and laughable. If you think of mobile phones when they first came out, they were the size of a suitcase, they were in a car, and the only two people on the planet on the mobile phone were circling the one antenna in a city that basically was within maybe 50 feet of where they had to be within 50 feet of it in order to actually get any reception. And we all know how that's changed things. And you can think about digital photography that toppled Kodak, so many kinds of things that started out very simply and almost laughable. And there's a very influential and very interesting economist by the name of Carlota Perez from the University of Cambridge in the UK. And she talks about disruptive technologies coming along about once every 70 years, 70. And she's broken them down into 5, starting with the Industrial Revolution, steam and railways in 1829, all the way down to 1971, and she defines the start of the current age, or the microprocessor, or the computer information age, as when Intel introduced the microprocessor in 1971. Two interesting things that I think are worth, I thought it was useful to talk about as she defines a disruptive technology and the era that follows it. The first part of it is the installation of the technology itself. So Intel releasing the microprocessor. And then the infrastructure, which goes all the way to the PCs, the Mac, all the way down to the internet itself being laid down. Then she says, typically there's a disruption that follows. As the technology gets introduced, existing companies slowly catch up, if they can, to using the technology, or new entrants come in and eat their lunch. But at some point, there will be, as Alan Greenspan said, irrational exuberance. Just a little bit too much will be going ahead of reality, And then there's a disruption phase. And then the second part of that is when a deployment really comes in and innovation happens. And that's when you get the real benefits of that age, which she calls the golden age. So the first part is an installation, the technology gets out there, there's a disruption, and then there's a deployment where the true innovation and you make use of all the infrastructure in place. And that becomes a golden age. So I thought I'll take a couple of moments to just quickly walk through my take on the information age today and how it relates to knowledge. So in 1971, Intel introduced the microprocessor. 1981 was IBM and the PC. 1991, conveniently 10 years later, Tim Berners-Lee released the www spec. In 1995, a little-known technology called the WikiWeb, now we call the Wiki, was introduced. And perhaps the other big, huge leap was in 2007 with the iPhone, which has really transformed the smartphone industry in general and also how we think about access to information. And then, of course, 2008, we had the worst depression since the Great Depression in the US and most of the world. So the opportunity we have got here really is then, so we've now got, if Carlota's thesis is right, we've got the innovation there, we've got the infrastructure played in, and now the next step, we have the disruption, and the next step is the golden age. So we'll take a moment now to reflect on what Peter Drucker, probably the management guru all management gurus look up to, said in 1999, that the single and the biggest contribution of management to the 20th century was a 50-fold increase in productivity of the manual worker in manufacturing. And he said that the single biggest contribution management needs to make in the 21st century is to increase the productivity of the knowledge worker. And this is a problem that's still, so he said that in 1999, and this is still a pretty big problem. So McKinsey Research in 2013 did some work and found that about 48% of your team's work week is spent doing three things: looking for internal information, finding somebody who has that internal information, or perhaps the worst use of knowledge management tools today, processing email. And that in just 4 industries, they said if you fix this, there's a potential of $1.3 trillion a year of productivity gain possible. So this problem of knowledge management and the productivity improvement that Peter Drucker asked for is not even close to being done, but I think we have a shot at it. If you think about it, what I believe now is we're in the golden age of information age, and you're starting to see this. I think the first time most of us saw things like Uber and Airbnb, all these are transformations, just disruptions of existing industries by sharing physical goods. I think the next big opportunity we have for the rest of this information age, which is about maybe 15 or 20 more years, is to share knowledge and get massive amounts of productivity increase there. So with that, I'd like to just move. So that was a talk in Chicago. There was more to it, but that was just the high-level concepts behind it. What I talked a little bit about was also the difference between different types of problems. So what I thought I'll do is I'll just walk through 3 kinds that some scientists use as they classify problems. The first one is a simple problem, and a simple problem is effectively can be solved by like a recipe. So cooking a French-style omelette or an Indian-style omelette involves certain techniques, because the techniques for an Indian versus a French omelette are different. But once you get the technique mastered, you just follow simple steps. I think most people outside our field in the knowledge world think of knowledge management as solving simple problems. It's the frequently asked questions. It's just a break and a fix. Ask a question and get a solution. And I think that's one of the conception challenges we've got to overcome. The second type of problem that experts talk about is a complicated problem. And a complicated problem, an example would be sending a rocket to the moon. It is difficult. There's lots and lots of variables. There's lots of things that can change. There's lots of people, there's lots of teams, often working in real time, often working across different time zones and on different parts of it, all of which need to come together at just the right time. However, once you get all that right, experience works for you. The more experience you get doing it, the less likely you have a problem happening. Having said that, even today with complicated problems, you can have mishaps. After all, rockets still do blow up at launch or even in space, or they fail. But experience will help you, and you can break down complicated problems into a series of small, simpler problems. Complex problems are like raising a child. And the analogy there works because you could have two sets of children. You could raise them in a similar environment, in a similar way, but the outcomes you can never predict. And experience in being successful with one does not mean too much for the second. So that's the three kinds of examples of simple, complicated, and complex. Recipe, you know the technique, you put the solution in. Complicated is where it's many, many difficult things, but you can break it into smaller pieces, multiple groups working on it across time and space, but it's still doable, and experience does make a big difference in terms of how successful you get. And the last one is complex, where experience doesn't matter as much, and the outcome can be completely different every single time. I think what we often see is that people fixate on knowledge management as being simple or too complex. Because it can't solve a complex problem, we think it doesn't work. But I actually believe we have a huge amount of opportunity, even in the complicated, in order to get knowledge management to get big productivity gains. Fiona, did we have any questions on this coming in so far? And you're on mute if you are, if there is a question.
Yes, I was on mute. I was going to see first if there was anyone on the call that would like to ask a question or has any comments on any of Phil's talk.
Yeah, I see one that came in, and maybe it's a good time to bring it up now, and that is, can you give an example of a complicated, or how knowledge management can help in a complicated situation where there is a lot of information changing in real time and there's impact? So let me take a stab at that. So I think if you think of an environment, so I'll give an example. In a company I used to work at, we used to have about 1 million hits a second on the network. And when there was an escalation that came up, most often the frontline, very senior people, could resolve the issue. But when it escalated up to the next level and people needed to be an expert, true deep expert needed to be called in to resolve the issue, the problem was that they would never search a static knowledge base because, heck, they are the people who wrote these protocols and some of the top people in the world in that field. So their motivation to go in and look for something existing was very low. However, the way we got them interested in working with knowledge and updating information in real time was to say, what if you catch this problem and just attach it in a very simple way that says, I have no idea what's going on, but I think something's going on. Here are the symptoms. If anybody sees this, just let me know and we can work on it together. That was effectively their knowledge article, not published to the public, just published with the right level of workflow granularity for another internal person to come in. And so they created an article that very simply on the fly that said, I have no clue what's going on, but if something like this comes up, let me know. 10 seconds later, that's 10 million hits later, if somebody in another country also gets that problem, by searching early and searching often, they can very simply go in and see that this expert says, I have no clue, but I've got this problem I'm trying to work out. Let's work on it together. The amount of time that's saved by having to not repeat an escalation or having people work through in parallel on the same problem is quite a big time saving. And the key here is that it's not like you're in a facility. So I think often people think of it as a break and a fix. So if you have a piece of equipment going down and there's an outage in, say, all of San Francisco, you can easily look it up and say, yep, this piece of equipment is out, and so many viewers cannot see the cable broadcast or whatever it is. However, when you've got that solution changing often because of maybe rolling blackouts or a bug or a hacker attack, when it's not a static one solution affects everybody, but changing quickly, that's when you can really have very simple techniques with how you capture, structure, and reuse that article in a knowledge base to make a difference. Hope that made sense to the person who asked the question. Any others on this? So I'll keep going on with a couple of questions that came in from the community. So the questions that came in when, as Sunula mentioned, when you registered, you had an opportunity to ask questions. It doesn't necessarily need to be about this topic, and I'm not necessarily the expert to answer all of them. So this is where we'll unmute the lines, or please let us know electronically if you have a question. Broadly, the questions were around how do you motivate people? How do you challenge? So how do you handle people's egos getting hurt when you say an article needs to be updated, and using that as an education opportunity? What are some of the techniques to increase content contribution? So both the quality and the speed, the quantity and the speed as you publish new articles, and how to best enable support agents to be able to make the mind shift from case data to knowledge. So if anybody has got comments or questions, you're welcome to jump in, but otherwise I'll take a shot. So in terms of the motivation, I'll just go through this slide because this really talks about Clever's philosophy on this. And again, this is not meant to be a sale of any kind, but just to walk you through how we approach the problem. For knowledge sharing to stick, people have to want to share knowledge, and they have to become part of how they do their job. Both are really important. The how they do their job is usually where we get other parts of it, which include the technology. And we always say, as many people do, that it's people, process, then technology. So it has to be enabled by technology, not technology first. There is a professor out of Stanford called B.J. Fogg, who's come up with a formula that he talks about changing behavior. And that means there's three things you need, which is motivation. I've got to want to do something. I've got to want to lose weight. It just doesn't happen by accident. I've got to have the ability. I can't just say I'm going to fly a plane. I need an ability to fly. I need the plane. I need fuel. I need training, all sorts of skill sets. And I need a trigger. And the trigger, the example I use most often is if you're trying to not drink too much at your company holiday party, what you want is a nudge before your second drink that it may be time to stop drinking rather than after your fifth drink when it's too late. Most companies spend the time, I think, on the ability, which is really the technology or just the process alone. And I think where we're missing out a bit is in the motivation and trigger. So back to the questions, that motivation is really important. It's the what's in it for me. And as we've started playing around with, playing around the bad word, working with other kinds of groups outside service and support and engineering and IT, which are the domains we know really well, into sales. If you're a coin-operated salesperson, just this touchy-feely help somebody else kind of will not work by itself. You really have to have backing from managers, for example. Same way, the motivation in the example I gave of a very, very senior person who is not going to be interested in looking at known problems. Their ego, their motivation, their desire is from not finding things that other people have solved, but from finding and solving new problems that nobody's seen before or variations. So I think really spending the time to understand the motivation is important. On the second point is the rejecting. I think the key word there is rejecting. I think humans have a really hard problem when they feel that they are graded. So that's why I always say you should guide, not grade. And the difference is when you're grading, it sounds like good or bad, right or wrong. Whereas the guiding says we as the managers as well and leaders have to understand the context of both the person solving the issue, creating knowledge, using it, and also the customer or the customer's customer. So we really have to understand rather than just saying, if you do X, things are good, and if you do Y, things are bad. And I'd always go back to real life in that example. It does not make sense to say to a child or to a person, if you run, if you do X, it's bad. In real life, there's too many ifs and it depends. So I think the main point is if they feel graded, that is where the rejection comes in. And I think that's not going to work. So you're probably much better off talking about guiding them as to the context behind it. Why did he do it? What did he think about? What's the context behind it? Let me pause here and ask again if there are any comments. So anybody else from Clever is on who wants to talk about it? I'll give it maybe 10, 15 seconds.
Hey, Phil, it's Bill, also from Clever.
Hi, Bill.
I thought I would add to this piece you just talking about two things that we really found useful in some of the places I've worked. One of them was that we positioned knowledge articles as kind of a thinking out loud piece of writing. So, for example, in addition to the other things you want in a knowledge article, we would also say, so what did you do to understand the issue and what did you do to resolve it? So kind of that background information. Now, sometimes people are kind of locked into putting this into a particular case, but we encourage people to put that in a kind of an analysis section in an article. And what that did for us is it allowed us to kind of go back and say, so why, what was your thinking? Why did you do this here? When the person says, well, because the application was doing blah, it's kind of a chance for us to, just say something like, well, actually the application doesn't work like that. Let's look at the application. So we would use it as kind of a thinking out loud so we can understand how they were even approaching or looking at, the kind of complicated apps we were supporting or whatever it was. Anyway, we kind of position almost from the outset, articles are kind of in play all the time until they're obsolete, in which case we're going to get rid of them. So if they're in play all the time, it was kind of a collective thinking out loud. And whoever used it last, it was kind of our opportunity to kind of consider this their thinking out loud. One other thing that we found really worked well was that when we were looking at articles, rather than kind of grading, as you said, what we were doing is we had a quick little stand-up really meeting where the groups where this was working the best, they were doing 15 minutes a day. And one of the things they would do in that 15 minutes was grab an article and kind of consider it as a group. And so everybody could kind of say, what would make this article better? And just the process of saying, what would make it better? It wasn't we were saying it was bad. We weren't saying we weren't even, to be honest, we weren't even trying to reject it. We were just saying, what would make it better? And just as a little scrum of 15 minutes a day, that part of that scrum was just how do we make this article better? And then we just say whoever's the last one to use it was the one who would update it. So if that was an author or whatever. Anyway, those are the two things I thought about when I answered this question about rejecting articles. We thought of them as thinking out loud, which meant it was always in play, and the other thing was we did a quick little scrum. You can't do that for every article by any means, but 5 articles a week per shift kind of thing was pretty useful.
Thanks, Bill. That makes a lot of sense. I liked in particular the example of the Scrum where, again, it's all of us making it better for both ourselves, the motivation, and for our customers. And I know there's a couple of people on the call who come from the non-technology centric, non-tech support services, IT, engineering world, call center world. And I think for them, whenever they think of technology and articles, the assumption is this is some heavy process, some heavy technology, because they might have people from R&D, from sales, from legal, people who are not in a CRM tool all the time. And their challenge is, how do I get them to share knowledge? And so they'll use things like SharePoint and assume that's the only way to do it. The reason I bring this up is back to the rejecting and the increasing content contribution. Even free wikis can do a lot of magic for you. It's always the process and the people side that's more important. And Bill, I think when you were at a major Wall Street bank, you found the same thing, true? Correct? Where you were, can you just tell a little bit about that story about the technology versus the wiki?
Actually, yeah. I talk about this a lot, so apologies to anybody who's maybe heard this, but one of the things that we did was we, rather than buying a tool, or rather than kind of focusing on the technology first, we kind of followed some advice and said, okay, what's the practices? And we said we would start off by using a wiki, which was free of charge to us, to do our initial knowledge kind of management as our initial KV. It was, from a tech support point of view, it was clunky because you'd have to toggle between systems if you wanted to, like the ticketing system where you got the issue into your queue versus the wiki where you had the knowledge that you were trying to use. But and also the search wasn't the great. But the most important things for us were that literally as we were kind of designing our program, we could actually configure the wiki, say for an article template on the fly right in front of everybody. So we'd have an idea, we'd incorporate it right on the spot. So it's very flexible and handy in that way. And then the other thing was that we found that within 3 months, even using this clunky kind of wiki, kind of non-ticketing, like, in other words, it wasn't a tech support knowledge-based system, anything like that. It was just a plain wiki like all of us kind of have access to. Even within 3 months, by just fixing, by focusing on our behavior and our practices and the small habits that made us better in terms of flowing information, we were, depending on which group within the bank that I was working with at the time, because I had several that we kicked off with at the same time, but those groups are solving, up to 50% more issues, even with this clunky kind of system. And what that really did for us, I thought, was really help us understand what we really then wanted and needed in a tool, and even how to kind of put a business justification for it. So, the wiki was great for us in terms of baking in the practices first, and then we worried about the technology later. And I have to say it was a real win. It did not hold us back at all, as far as I could tell. Within our progress within 3 months was beyond my expectations, I had to say.
Hey, Phil, this is Rajul. Are you okay if I just jump in?
Of course, Rajul, please.
Okay, excellent. First time caller? Yep. I just wanted to add to this conversation about knowledge management. One is about the process to write the right knowledge articles. I wonder if you ever thought about looking at actual source of truth systems within the company that are the authoritative sources of information that you could leverage and actually piggyback on them and share that information in the knowledge base so that you don't replicate the information. And secondly, it's not about who will keep it updated, because there are owners of that information who already maintain that information. So it's when you look at the knowledge management overall holistically, the knowledge base is a key engagement with the customers, but trying to direct them to the right sources and promoting other pieces of information that is maintained and sustained is also another good way. So as a community, beyond just the processes and the tools, you sort of become content and knowledge stewards, where you aggregate information and you drive people to the right sources.
Hey, Rajal, it's Bill again. I would say that I would agree with the point. I think you've made an excellent point. In fact, the way we did it was we used our knowledge base quite often as a pointer. So we just had links to those kind of golden sources, we call them, or you call it a source of truth. For the very reason you're saying, I didn't want it to maintain it a bunch of times. And so we basically said one source, and we'll point to it. And it worked very, very well. I think you made a great point.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. And I think the other thing, Rajal, as you're talking about that, I just was reflecting, so 100% agreed with your point and Bill's exclamation mark on it. The other side of it is, I think what people often forget is that the vast majority of people, the single source of truth for them is Google. That 60 to 70% of the US market, it's over 90% of the European market. Even big companies that have their search engines and technologies will admit that the vast majority of, again, customer-facing stuff, people will look on the internet.
Okay.
Now, again, if you have something very proprietary, understood is different. But this is not just for consumer. So that's one thing to look at, is where your public is searching. Go backwards to that, and then maybe make that the right point to the right source of truth is another way to add value, as you just said. I think that will be an important point. The second thing is, I think sometimes people come and ask us, so I think that the difference would be, in our way of thinking, the real thing for knowledge management is very simple. Every time you see a piece of information, you should leave it in a better state for the next person. That's it. If everybody in the company does that, internal to a company, you can get some pretty profound states, improvements. As an example there, if you have that source of truth, you still have somebody who has to enter information into that source of truth. So with things like big data, when you get results back, you might get variations within that source of truth. So every time somebody looks at that source of truth inside the company, how do I make sure if it's not just right in the context that I'm looking for it, how do I make it better? What simple mechanism can we put in place to allow the feedback to happen and it to be updated? That will make that golden source of truth or platinum source of truth or something, or diamond or whatever this next stage will be. But these are the little things that we can do. But I really love the premise of what you said. We don't have to recreate. And often, others or collectively, we know more than any one of us.
Got it.
Point. Any other comments or thoughts on that? Or questions before we go to the next set? Yeah, I think the comment about the methods to increase content contribution, quality, and quantity and cycle time, my take on that is the biggest mistake we make generically, and I've made many, many times in my career, is to assume one size fits all. So if you just break down these complicated problems into smaller types, so for example, if there are customers, internal or consumers of that information who don't need all the caveats and don't need all the oh my goodness, this has not been spell checked, it's not been cleared by legal, whatever it is. If they can handle that information, why don't you give them that information? So if it's an expert mechanic doing F1 racing, a race car, the crew in the F1 races, then you don't need to tell them what a carburetor is and the fact that you might have misspelled a carburetor, the word carburetor. Just give it to them or tell them what to do with it. They can handle with it, and within the context of their situation, they can decide whether to apply that piece of knowledge or not. But certainly if it's me or my mother, the last thing you want to do is to give that information because I might damage myself and the car in the process. So I think really I would just suggest look and see what type of problem it is, if it's simple, complicated, or complex. Most often, complex I think is a very difficult set of things to deal with now, but we can work on complicated, break it into smaller parts, look at the person who's consuming the knowledge, and give it to them in a way that they can consume it. Simple, short, sweet, quick, in their context, that they can make a difference immediately. And I think if you do it that way, you'll be shocked at how you're solving the problems for people at the right time. And again, just remember, it's not just simple solutions, break, fix, how do I questions. It's the complicated questions I'm talking about. Any thoughts, comments, challenges from somebody else? Opinions? I think the last one then from my side would be this: how to best enable support agents to make the shift from case data to knowledge. And again, for the non-tech support service engineering kind of folks on the phone, the idea is that when you have many people contacting you, you will have information about each call or each person in the case data. So Philip called and he's clueless. He's called 16 times about the same issue. Well, that's the metadata in the case I might put in. But the knowledge context is, here's how I solved the problem, or here's the resolution or the work in progress. That would be a one-to-many. So one piece of knowledge or one article of knowledge could solve many cases. I think, I'm not sure I've got a great answer for this, but to me, this goes back into context. If people understand the context of how you're trying to approach a problem and why it's good or not so good, you can make a difference. I think what we do is when people call us often when people call us, we solve a problem with a simple break or a fix, a question and an answer. But the problem from the perspective of the client may be complicated. Just because you give a piece of the puzzle, they may need other pieces of the puzzle from different vendors to actually get their solution. And sometimes helping agents to understand, or engineers or anybody to understand that what people ask may not be what they need. It may be necessary, but may not be sufficient to solve the problem. So again, giving context and guiding, I think will help, but it's always easier to break it into smaller pieces and solve it piece by piece. It's probably a rambling answer to the question, but if anybody can bail me out on that, that'll be great. Otherwise, this is the best you'll get for the moment. Okay. So again, my take, just quickly.
I can actually.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hey, Philip Summer. I was just going to say, in context to the last item, the the case data are really interesting to the team that's working the cases. The way that we try to get them to get in the habit of abstracting out is for them to actually be forced to summarize in a different tool. Now, I don't like saying that folks need to type everything twice, but it ends up saving them time as the customer data is naturally cleansed as they try to rephrase the problem. I've found with my guys that helps just to get their head in a different place than, this customer always calls on Tuesdays and it always sucks or anything like that.
I see. That makes sense. Thanks, Amma. Right. So I think most of these questions really come down to the same thing, which is how, if I see a piece of information, how do I make it better? And for that to happen, people have to want to make it better, and they've got to make it better easily. And one last piece I'll say here is that while most of us tend to be in the support, maybe in one division of the company, you can see productivity increases of 20, 30, 40%. Even within a group when they share knowledge better. This is productivity increases. What we're starting to see is productivity increase of 300% plus. And that is when you get multiple groups in the company across departments looking at the customer experience from the lens of knowledge. What could I do to make the life of the customer better before a contact, during a contact, after a contact? Again, substitute customer for person asking for information. And then the second part of that is, what can I do to make it easier for other groups in the company? What piece of knowledge did I wish the salesperson had that would make my life better? Hint, don't promise that I can be out there in the Czech Republic tomorrow. Just as all get them off your back, right? So maybe a cavalier example, but the point is, what could we share? So when you get different groups of the company looking at the customer experience before, during, after a contact, and helping the customer and helping internally, small, simple changes often could make a 200-300% plus productivity improvements. It's really quite powerful, and we can get to what Drucker was talking about. Finula, over to you.
Yeah, I don't see any additional questions in the chat window, but certainly if you had a question that you submitted through your registration that we didn't capture today, we'd love you to go into the community and ask it of the community as well. As Phil has on the slide here, there are many ways that Clever can help you. We have our enterprise assessment, which is really targeting folks who are either launching or relaunching a knowledge program to help them understand their knowledge sharing capabilities and where to start from there. Provides a roadmap and a report and a benchmark to sort of set your guidance moving forward. We have our Clever Enterprise training, which addresses a lot of the behavior and motivation factors that Phil mentioned as well. And then we also have our Clever Accelerator. For those of you that have a specific pain point that you're trying to address, we can come in and help you focus in those areas as well. But again, we're glad you were able to join us today. We will be taking a short break from the Talking Tuesday sessions this summer, but are excited to launch again in September with sort of a new framework and a new format moving forward, and we hope you'll continue to be a part of that. But in the meantime, we'd love you to continue visiting us in the Clever community and library for additional knowledge sharing resources, and more importantly, to continue to engage in these conversations and discussions. So please continue to join us there over the summer, and we'll look forward to connecting with you through the community and these sessions moving forward.
Thank you all very, very much. Really appreciate it. Cheers.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.